Church History in Plain Language, 5th edition, by Bruce L. Shelley. Chapter 23, Chaos and the Law of Necessity, Decline of the Papacy. The 14th century appeared to break upon Europe on a triumphant note. On February 2nd, 1300, Pope Boniface VIII proclaimed a jubilee, a holy year, to celebrate the new centenary of Christ's birth. It was the first of its kind. The official decree announced a full and copious pardon of all their sins for all who reverently visited the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul during the holy year. Joyous throngs poured into the eternal city. 6 3/4 centuries later, Pope Paul the Sixth, echoed Boniface's words in announcing that 1975 would be another holy year. The gift of the plenary indulgence were Paul's words. And as the first holy year, Rome threw open her arms to the throngs who came. Boniface VIII, 1294 to 1303, the founder of the Holy Years, had a flair for pomp and circumstance. Several times he appeared before the pilgrims in imperial robes, crying, "I am Caesar, I am emperor." According to reports, his papal crown contained 48 rubies, 72 sapphires, 45 emeralds, and 66 large pearls. He could afford to be generous with pardons and for spiritual pilgrims. At the Church of St. Paul, according to one chronicler, generous celebrants kept 2 priests busy night and day, raking together infinite money. The decades ahead looked bright to Boniface because for 2 centuries the papacy had held an unrivaled peak of power, religious and political. The Pope had before him the sparkling example of Innocent III, a pope highly skilled at imposing his will on emperors and kings. Boniface naturally assumed that he could continue the same practice. Within 3 years of the Jubilee, however, Boniface was to die of the shock of the greatest personal insult ever inflicted on a pope. Even as the Jubilee celebrants rejoiced, forces were at work that marked the beginning of the end of medieval papal sovereignty. How could such a thing happen? What occurred to change the worldly power of the popes? Sleep and change in the kingdom. Jesus once told a parable about a man who scattered seed on the ground. Mark 4:26-29. Night and day, whether the man was asleep or awake, the seed sprouted and grew. The man had no idea how the grain grew. The soil simply produced the stalk, then the head, and finally the whole kernel in the head, all by itself. This, said Jesus, is what the kingdom of God is like. Significant changes often take place while those affected are unaware of what is happening. The 14th century was such a time. The papacy continued its business as usual attitude while important ideas and social forces changed the face of Christianity. We call the period between 1300 and 1500 the age of the decline of the Middle Ages because of the idea of Christendom, which unified the millennium between the 4th and 14th centuries, was under vigorous attack. Christendom was made possible by the harmony of 2 ideas, the Christian Empire and the Catholic Church. The image of the Christian Empire, so useful in creating a unified Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries, slowly faded in importance in the 12th and the 13th centuries, as papal influence spread. Innocent III demonstrated that papal sovereignty was far more effective in rallying princes for a crusade or in defending the faith against heretics. The significance of the 14th and 15th centuries lies not only in the further decline of the empire, but in the dramatic loss of papal prestige. The 14th century is too early to speak of nations in the modern sense of the term, but more and more people were getting used to the idea that they were English or French whenever their thoughts reached beyond their own town or religion. And perhaps more important, They found it possible to think of their state functioning without direct papal guidance. In modern terms, they began to think of secular and sacred affairs, a realm for the state as well as a realm for the church. This new way of looking at the world appears most vividly in the events swirling about the popes. Europe was slowly moving away from its feudal past. Land was less important. Hard cash was the new thing. Increasingly, those at the top of the power structure realized that they had to command ever larger sources of revenue. This, in turn, required a broader authority to tax. The struggle between the Church and the national monarchies of England and France touched off the turmoil of the 14th century. Edward I ruled in England, Philip the Fair in France. Both were strong and self-assured, and at odds with each other over lands in France, still under English control. To finance their costly campaigns, Edward and Philip hit on the same solution: tax the clergy within their realms. But in the Pope's view, church revenues were exempt from compulsory assessments and taxable only by the church. In 1296, Boniface VIII had issued Clericus Laicis, a document threatening excommunication for any lay ruler who taxed the clergy and for any churchman who paid those taxes without papal consent. But Edward and Philip were a new breed of monarch, secular, unimpressed by threats from Rome. Edward's retort was to decree that if the clergy did not pay, they would be stripped of all legal protection and their extensive properties would be seized by the king's sheriffs. Philip's answer was to place a complete embargo on the export of all gold, silver, and jewelry from his domains, thus depriving the papal treasury of a major source of revenue from church collections in France. Faced with such stiff opposition, Boniface backed down, explaining that he had not meant to cut off clerical contributions for defense in times of dire need. Since the kings could decide what constituted defense in dire need, the victory for Edward and Philip was clear. A new voice in Christendom. The royal victory, however, was far from complete. Buoyed by the smashing success of the Jubilee year, Boniface concluded that the spiritual reverence manifested for him in every corner of Christendom extended to the civil sphere as well. He had a second circlet added to his crown as a symbol of his temporal sovereignty. Concentrating his fire upon Philip, the Pope determined to teach the French monarch a lesson. Philip, however, represented a strident new voice in Christendom. Jesus Christ, he held, gave the Church no temporal authority. In 1301, the king imprisoned a French bishop on charges of treason. Boniface ordered the official's release and rescinded his earlier concession on taxation of church lands. The next year, Philip responded by summoning representatives of the French nobility, clergy, and bourgeois. The debut of his National Assembly, the Estates General, in mustering their unanimous support in his quarrel with the Pope, one of Philip's ministers put the choice baldly. My master's sword is made of steel. The Pope's is made of words. Several months later, Boniface issued Unam Sanctum, the most extreme assertion of papal power in all of church history. This time Boniface made his meaning unmistakable. It is altogether necessary, he declared, for every human being to be subject to the Roman pontiff. If King's counter-move was no less drastic, he prepared to have Boniface deposed. On the term move was no less drastic. He prepared to have Boniface deposed on the ground that his election had been illegal. To execute this plan, he chose William of Nogaret, a shrewd lawyer, who was helping Philip build the foundations of his nation. Nogaret was also a master of the trumped-up charge. He had been known to approve the use of voluntary testimony obtained by such a device as stripping a witness, smearing him with honey, and hanging him over a beehive. His case against Boniface included not only the illegitimacy of his election, but also heresy, simony, and immorality. Armed with the authority from an assembly of French church officials and nobles, he rushed to Italy, determined to bring the Pope to France for trial before a special church council. Boniface, now 86, had left the heat of Rome to summer in the foothills of the Apennine mountains at his birthplace. Anagni, Nogaret, and some troops he had marshaled broke in on the aged Boniface in his bedroom. Whether they actually manhandled him is in dispute, but certainly they heaped abuse on him. They kept him prisoner for several days. When the people of Anagni realized what was happening, they rose up and rescued Boniface. Numbed and humiliated, the aged pope died within weeks. Contemporaries said, "He crept in like a fox, reigned like a lion, and died like a dog." What is the significance of the Anagni episode? It reveals that European Christians no longer accepted papal interference in what they regarded as purely political matters. No one could say with certainty what a purely political matter was, but a king's power within his own country was a generally accepted fact. At the same time, an outrage against a pope, even an unpopular one, was widely resented. Boniface was not a beloved pope. He was a target of widespread criticism. Dante, the Italian genius who wrote the Divine Comedy, reserved a place in hell for him. Yet he was the vicar of Christ. Not many at that time could conceive of Christianity without the Holy Father. Thus, even when they had no political terms for it, people in the early 14th century were beginning to distinguish secular and religious authority and to recognize the rights of each in its own place. And that was new. Anagni came to symbolize the descent of papal power, even as Canossa, some 2 centuries before, it symbolized its ascent. When Boniface's successor in Rome died after a brief, ineffectual reign, Philip's daring coup bore its fruit. In 1305, the College of Cardinals elected a Frenchman, the Archbishop of Bordeaux, as Pope Clement V. Clement never set foot in Rome, preferring to stay closer to home, where he was always accessible to royal bidding. The captivity of the Holy Father. Clement's election marked the start of the 72-year period in church history called, after the long exile of the ancient Jews in Babylon, the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Following Clement, 6 successive popes, all of French origin, chose to reside in a little town called Avignon, rather than in Rome. Avignon was located on the Rhone River, just across from the borders of Philip's domain. Under the popes, the town grew to a busy city of 80,000, and its immense clerical bureaucracy and sumptuous papal palace. This removal of the papacy to Avignon was more than a matter of geography. In the thinking of European people, Rome, the eternal city, stood not only for the idea of the apostolic succession of the Church founded upon St. Peter, but also for the concept of Western universality. Roman Imperium. Avignon, on the other hand, was surrounded on all sides by the French kingdom and was a mere tool in the hands of one nation, the power-hungry French. The Avignon papacy was bitterly resented in Germany. In 1324, Emperor Louis the Bavarian, 1314-47, moved against Pope John the 22nd by appealing to a general council. Among the scholars supporting such a move was Marsilius of Padua, who had fled from the University of Paris. In 1326, Marcellus had his colleague John of Jandun presented Louis with a work titled Defender of the Peace, which questioned the whole papal structure of the Church and called for a democratic government. Defender of the Peace asserted that the Church was the community of all believers, and that the priesthood was not superior to the laity. Neither popes nor bishops nor priests had received any special function from Christ. They served only as agents of the community of believers, which was represented by the General Council. This radical and revolutionary view of the Church transformed the papacy into the executive office of the Council and subordinated the Pope to the authority of the Council. The theory, called conciliarism, would soon find a place not only in theory but in fact. Most of the hostility aimed at the Avignon papacy complained of the use and abuse of money. The decline in revenues from the papal states in Italy had brought the papal court to bankruptcy. To replace these funds and raise new ones, the Avignon popes resorted to a host of money-making schemes, some old, some new. There were fees for this privilege and taxes for that. For example, the popes introduced a rule that whenever a bishop was appointed, the first year's income, called an annat, should go to the pope. To fill a vacancy, popes often transferred a bishop from another city and thus created more annates. Or perhaps the pope delayed the appointment and received all the income in the interim. This was called a reservation. The most lucrative practice, however, was the granting of indulgences. They were dispensed for the most minor reasons, from building bridges to waging wars. Extravagant claims of their spiritual benefits mounted with each generation. Bitter feelings against the papacy increased, especially when the Holy Father demanded this tax or that revenue under threat of excommunication. By 1360, turmoil in Italy over the papal states, plus the outcries against the French domination of the papacy, made it clear that the Avignon papacy could not continue indefinitely. No one could foresee, however, the outrageous events the return to Rome would bring. Profiles of Faith. Catherine of Siena, 1347-80. At age 30, had enough influence to travel from her home in Siena, Italy, to Avignon, France, and persuade the Pope to return to Rome after the papal court had been in captivity since 1309. Catherine belonged to the Dominican Third Order for lay people who sought spiritual lives without monastic confines. Her mystical writings and her service and evangelism among plague victims and condemned convicts gained the youthful Catherine a large following. Upset by her efforts for church reform, opponents charged her with heresy, but she was formally cleared of all charges. She helped negotiate an end to war between Tuscany and the papacy, then spent the last 2 years of her life attempting to heal the great schism between rival popes. The dialogue, a conversation between her and God the Father, which she dedicated, is considered a jewel of Italian literature. In 1377, the aged Pope Gregory XI re-entered Rome. Joy over the re-establishment of the papacy in the Eternal City was short-lived. Gregory's death within a year required a new papal election. The College of Cardinals, still heavily weighted with Frenchmen, yielded to the clamor of a Roman mob and chose an Italian. On April 18th, Easter Sunday, the new Pope, Urban VI, was crowned. All the cardinals were present. The summer months, however, along with Urban's dictatorial ways, brought second thoughts about his selection. In August, the cardinal suddenly informed all Europe that the people of Rome had forced the election of an apostate to the chair of Peter, and that the proceedings were invalid. A month later, the apostates responded by creating practically a new college of cardinals. For their part, the French cardinals chose from their own number another pope, Clement VII, and announced this fact to the various civil and church authorities. Clement VII moved about Italy and eventually sailed for France and Avignon. The Great Papal Schism. Thus, with Urban ruling from Rome and Clement from Avignon, the murky chapter in papal history called the Great Schism of the papacy begins. It lasted for 39 years. Each pope had his own college of cardinals, thereby ensuring the papal succession of its own choice. Each pope claimed to be the true vicar of Christ, with the power to excommunicate those who did not acknowledge him. Such breaches had occurred before, both before and after the schism. There were pious souls who rejected the claims of the Roman Church, but now no one was rejecting any such claims, no one except the Church of Rome itself. It was engaged in both promoting and rejecting its own pontiff. The proper identity of the true pope was a matter of considerable importance to Christendom. Unfortunately, the only witnesses to the problem, the cardinals, contradict themselves flatly. If what they said in April was true, and what they said in September was untrue. If what they said in September was accurate, then what they said in April was not. It was left to universities, kings, bishops, dukes, and just about everyone else to decide who the true vicar of Christ was. France went with Clement, Italy with Urban. The Empire went with Urban. So did England. Scotland went with Clement. But within each country, minorities existed. Tumults and riots broke out. Property was burned and crusades were preached. A house divided against itself could not stand. In 1395, leading professors at the University of Paris proposed that a general council representing the universal church should meet to heal the schism, but difficulties immediately arose. Canon law said that only the Pope could call a general council, and only the Pope could ratify any decision of a general council. Which Pope had those rights? In effect, canon law prohibited the reunion of Christendom. Was necessity a higher law? A new Pope elected. By 1409, a majority of the cardinals from both camps agreed that it was. They met for a general council at Pisa, on the west coast of Italy. They deposed both claimants to the papal chair and elected a third man, Alexander V. Neither of the two deposed popes, however, would accept the action of the council, so the church now had not two but three claimants to the chair of Peter. 3 popes at a time are too many by almost anyone's standards, especially so when one of the popes preaches a crusade against another and starts selling indulgences to pay for it. This bizarre spectacle stirred Europe sufficiently to goad its leaders into firm action. In 1414, the Holy Roman Emperor assembled at the German city of Constance, the most impressive church gathering of this era. Even the Greek Orthodox Church sent representatives. For the first time, voting took place on a purely national basis. Instead of the traditional assembly of bishops, the council included lay representatives and was organized as a convention of nations, German, Italian, French, and English, and Spanish entering later. Each nation had one note. The national structure of the council was highly significant. It shows that the Church was reluctantly coming to realize the new national alignment of power. At length, In 1417, the council got one papal incumbent to step aside, deposed the other two, and chose a new vicar of Christ, Martin V. One of the deposed popes, Benedict XIII of Avignon, clung to his claim, but for all practical purposes, the council in Constance ended the Great Schism. Necessity had triumphed, yet it was promptly denied. Martin reigned because of the council's action. Yet as soon as he was pope, he repudiated all acts of the council except the one by which he ruled. The legal mind of the Roman Church had never encountered so great a contradiction, not of theory, but of practice. Martin had good reason to deny the work of the council, for it raised an important question. Who is greater, a general council that creates the pope, or the pope who claims supremacy over councils? Profiles of faith. Joan of Arc, 1412 to 1431. At the age of 13 began having mystical visions in which God directed her to save France from English dominance during the 100 Years' War. Initially skeptical of Joan's claims, religious leaders thoroughly questioned her and concluded she was honest. Joan rallied thousands of French troops to drive the English out of Orleans. At 18, Joan was captured by those allied with England. She was charged with heresy, convicted for being a schismatic, and sentenced to execution. As she was burned at the stake, Joan's last word was Jesus. 25 years later, the Pope appointed a retrial of her case. She was declared innocent. During her imprisonment, Joan said, "If I were to say that God sent me, I shall be condemned, but God really did send me." The Councilor movement aimed at transforming the papacy into something like a limited monarchy. Constance solemnly declared that general councils were superior to popes, that they should meet at regular intervals in the future. The Pope called this heretical. His return to power, plus the inability of later councils to introduce much-needed reforms, enabled the popes, by 1450, to discredit the consular movement. They busied themselves not with religious reforms, but with Italian politics and patronage of the arts. The Pope often could not make up his mind whether he was the successor of Peter or of Caesar. Political corruption and immorality in the Vatican reached unbelievable heights under Rodrigo Borgia, who ruled as Alexander VI, 1492 to 1503. He was grossly immoral and obsessed with his passion to provide wealth and power for his children. Thus Constance could be denied. But it could not be forgotten. Estrangement from the Pope was growing. People began to think in terms of national churches, the church governed by representative bodies. The challenge of the Protestant Reformation was already prepared.